Excellent. Welcome everyone. Just trying to make sure everyone can see. Okay. Um, Welcome. This is our virtual session. Thank you for coming. I'm Dania Francis at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I'm very happy to have been asked and invited to chair this session. This is a session organized by the Association for Social Economics. I want to thank the panelists for really doing the groundwork and organizing this session. In particular, Stefan Lefebvre, thank you for being for getting us into shape and being so organized. So without further ado, I will do just a very brief introduction of our panelist. I should mention our topic is stratification economics, social policy, and low-wage workers. And the Association for Social Economics has a wonderful slate of panels centered on stratification economics. So I really encourage everyone to, look in your conference programs and hunt down those sessions. And so what we'll do is I'll introduce our panelists, get out of the way, and they will speak. And then in lieu of formal discussants, we've decided to have more of an open conversation. So after the panelists have finished, we'll open it up to your question and answers. And also, if the panelists have questions for each other, we'll open that up as well. Okay, so again, please feel free in the Q&A. I think you guys can pose questions in the Q&A. Pose them all along. They'll stay in there. We'll be able to refer back to them. I can verbalize the questions to the panelists, and we can go from there. So please don't hesitate to ask questions in the Q&A all along. Okay, so in our order of operations, we will have beginning Dr. Samuel L. Myers Jr., Roy Wilkins Professor of Human Relations and Social Justice in the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Okay, followed by Martha Susana Jaimes of the New School, Stefan Lefebvre, Assistant Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and Anastasia Wilson, Assistant Professor of Economics at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Myers.
Hello, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to integrate the discussion of stratification economics with the conventional methodologies of doing policy analysis. And so those of us who teach in policy schools frequently confront a level of disconnect between the conventional methodology of microeconomic policy analysis and the questions and concerns that we embrace and discuss, within policy analysis. And the particular subject matter illustration today focuses on race neutrality and public procurement and contracting. Now, stratification economics is different, from neoclassical economics or behavioral economics in the sense that it examines structural and intentional processes that are related to hierarchy and economic inequality among groups defined by race, ethnicity, or class. And it also offers policy prescriptions that differ from conventional policy recommendations that are rooted in rational choice models. Though policy prescriptions in modern policy analysis frequently begin with the assumption of rational choice behavior, if not by the participants, then at least by the decision makers, the policy makers. And it frequently views race, ethnicity, class, or identity as exogenous. And so it's a dummy variable in your regression and not a intentional component of the underlying structure of the matter. And the key question that the macroeconomic policy analysis addresses is the question of efficiency. And so we're really good at measuring costs and benefits. We're very good at determining what the efficiency aspects of a policy intervention happens to be. We're not particularly good at having consistency in measurement of alternative criteria for evaluating policy options, such as equity, such as responsiveness, and so forth. So it turns out that a particular case where this is relevant has to do with the case of public procurement and contracting. So in 1970, a floor amendment was added to the Public Works Employment Act by Perrin Mitchell, who was the Black congressman from the 4th Congressional District in Baltimore, Maryland, and who also for a while was the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. This floor amendment added to the Public Works Employment Act a set-asides for minority businesses. And the notion of minority set-asides actually flowed from the idea of set-asides for small businesses and set-asides for veteran-owned businesses. And this amendment created a national industry for race-based policymaking in the area of public procurement and contracting. But then in 1989, in the Supreme Court case of City of Richmond versus Croson, set-asides were banned. They were deemed to be suspect. And the response, well, I shouldn't say that set-asides were banned. What I should say is that race-conscious programs were deemed to be suspect. And there was the need in order to justify any race-conscious program, based on efficiency rule. The idea that there must be a compelling state interest for having the rule, and that if the rule is implemented, it has to be narrowly tailored. And so in 1999, the Department of Transportation proposed in a final rule, and in 49 CFR 26, that all agencies receiving DOT funds will be required to have a goal. Now that goal is different from a set-aside. And that the goal should be narrowly tailored, it should be flexible, it shouldn't be overly inclusive. It should minimize the burden placed on the firms. In other words, the goal should be an efficient goal, but it's also argued that the goal should maximize the race-neutral component of the goal. Okay, so what does that mean? So if you use conventional microeconomic approaches, what it means is that you first establish a base, and the base for the goal is measured by the relative availability of willing, able, qualified, disadvantaged business enterprises within the relevant industries and geographic marketplace. And then after you get the base, you can make an adjustment to the base, and that adjustment for the base can be based on things like barriers, credit, measures of discrimination. But then the next part is the really important part, and that is to maximize the portion of the goal that's race neutral. And so here's the logic. The logic is we really don't want a race conscious program. But if we're going to have a race conscious program, the part of the race conscious program that needs to be emphasized is the part of the race conscious program that doesn't take account of race. Now, some people believe that this was an interesting kind of rhetoric, interesting language here. It said, wait, we're not really going to have race conscious programs anymore. So what does it mean when you maximize the portion of the goal, which is an aspiration? And by the way, there's really no penalty for not meeting the goal. Okay, so what does it mean to maximize the race neutral portion? And so the conventional macroeconomic approach to maximizing the race neutral portion of goal is the first right out of the equation for how much was the amount of the dollars that would be going to disadvantaged business enterprise, controlling for things like the characteristics of the firm, the characteristics of the contract, where the X is characteristic of the firm, the Z is the characteristic of the contract, and then you have goal. And so the equation is in effect estimating the theta, and that the theta is the impact of the goal on the amount of dollars the DBE receives, and the premise is that that theta is something between, it's some positive value. It's greater than zero. But let's think about a phenomena, a conceptual phenomena, where we eliminate any impact of the goal, on the amount of the that's received by disadvantaged business enterprise. So conceptually, equate theta equal to zero, and after you equate theta equal to zero, you compute. And by the way, I said phi up there. I showed the theta is equal to zero, and so we want to get the natural log of dollars that are awarded to disadvantaged business enterprise hat, where natural log of y hat disadvantaged business enterprise is the projected value of the dollars that go to the disadvantaged business enterprises when there's no goal. Meaning you're maximizing the race neutral portion of the goal. And so the aspiration of G starred in period 2.1 is the forecast of the share of dollars that would go to disadvantaged business enterprise without a goal. And by the way, this doesn't tell you how to achieve the G star. It's that this is the aspiration. This is the portion of the goal that is achieved without having a goal. Okay, so it's interesting that the reason why that is equal to something other than zero is the fact that there are some contracts that are awarded without goals. And some of those contracts are awarded without goals because you have highly competitive firms. Some of it has to do with the instance where the size of the contracts are so low that you don't need to have a goal, and other circumstances. So here's the point. This point is that using conventional neoclassical models, you've got G star. And by the way, you can do it a lot of other ways in order to get similar calculations based on the logic of maximizing the race neutral portion of gold. But you see, the problem with that is that it assumes a level of rationality associated not only the decision maker, the people who are posting the goal, but also assumes a level of rationality among all the market participants. And so what happens if you deviate, from the conventional assumptions? So one of the assumptions that we make when doing microeconomic policy analysis is that the identity is exogenous. And so we have something called disadvantaged business enterprises, which is a combination of women and minorities. The minorities include socially disadvantaged groups, presumptively socially disadvantaged groups, including Asians, Hispanics, American Indians, immigrant firms. Well, let's be clear that the identity is assumed to be exogenous, but if I were a white male-owned firm and I wanted to avail myself of participation in the program, I'd give the 51% of the stock over to my daughter or to my wife. Okay, and that's not to say that that's fraud. No, that's not fraud. It's not fraud. I think it's good for white men to get their business to their daughters. But the problem is that suppose that there's minimal participation of women. Suppose there's minimum participation of women workers or women managers. Doesn't necessarily help the group it's designed to help, because did I say that Parent Mitchell introduced the floor amendment to the Public Works Act of 1977 with the specific intent to aid Black businesses. He didn't even think about women businesses at the time. He wasn't even thinking about American Indian businesses. He wasn't thinking about immigrant-owned businesses. 1977. But it turns out that if the aggregate of disadvantaged business enterprises is permitted to include lots of different things, then there's the risk that the race neutral goals doesn't help the group it's intended to help. Okay, let me tell you also about the issue of COVID-19. So suppose that within industries and across different racial and ethnic groups, there are different levels of participation in programs like the PPP program, like stimulus checks. Suppose that there's a difference in the exit from the industry across race, ethnicity, and gender. By using the aggregate of disadvantaged enterprises, then you run the risk of assuming that all racial ethnic groups are affected equally when there is a shutdown in businesses due to COVID-19. So very briefly, what is the stratification economics approach? The stratification economics approach would be to estimate separate regressions by race, ethnicity, and gender, for the probability of shutdown, for the probability of receiving a stimulus check or PPP loan, for the conditional bid rejection rates given a bid, and for the amounts of contract awarded. Now remember that the original goal is based just simply on the agnostic assumption that there's nothing going on in the background that determines your identity, that determines your registration, that determines which industries you're in, that determines whether or not you are bidding or getting rejected. And what stratification economics, which is an approach to intentionally looking at hierarchy and looking at racial disparities, requires, is that you do all those background calculations, and then you do the Blanda Oaxaca counterfactuals that would say, what would the race neutral goal be if we eliminated all of these differential treatment, in shutdowns and loans and stimulus checks and equal treatment. With that said, I should point out that there's an embargo on the data that I'm using for this analysis, so I can't share with you what the results are. But the basic implications that stratification economics requires investigating the underlying causes and the structural factors that are producing the disparities, and that the conventional models will often produce flawed results, and they will give you long-term biases in the application of federal rules. With that said, some of this work is included in a couple of papers in applied economics, and I welcome your opportunity, the opportunity to get your feedback. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Martha?
Can you hear me? Yes. And is my screen showing well? So can you see my
screen? It's not showing us full screen. Yeah, we just... Are
you seeing notes? Okay. Let's see. Yes. Sorry. Now? Good. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. My name is Marta Susana Jaimes, and I'm going to show an approximation to an extension of my job market paper, which I'm going to show the results of the job market paper and discuss some of the possible extensions related to the Social Security claiming decision for individuals and couples and its relation to the mortality risk of workers who actually claim Social Security workers' benefits in the United States. I want to thank the Social Security Administration and the Center for Retirement Research for funding of this research, and the Retirement Research Lab at the New School for ongoing support in my research. So with that said, an important feature of the Social Security is that around 1983, there was a reform based on a change in the claim and the possibility of claiming ages that seek actuarial fairness. And this idea is just that due to the possibility of early claiming and delayed claiming, according to full retirement age, workers receive a discount if they claim early, and they receive a credit if they claim later than their full retirement age. So the actuarial adjustments were created based on population average mortality. So most of the adjustments are conflating mortality risk for both men and women, which we know have different mortality risk and life expectancy at each moment in life. And it was based on a 3% real interest rate in 1980. This leads to an adjustment that, let's say, allows a full credit after full retirement age of almost 8% per year. And I'm sorry. And a discount of nearly 28% for early claiming. So one of the things that I wanted to test was whether there would be differential mortality rates according to the different ages at which workers claim. And this is because we acknowledge, and there's full literature already exploring the effects of socioeconomic status on mortality rates. So I had the question of whether this socioeconomic status and the decision to claim at different ages will be related, and what would be the impact of differential mortality on the actual effects on this. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of issues with my presentation. It's not moving forward, so let me test again. So an important thing that I also considered was relevant is that if there is a positive correlation between socioeconomic status and claim age, and a further correlation with mortality risk, this would imply that there's adverse selection in the claiming decision in the Social Security workers' benefits. So also, the literature has explored the relationship between socioeconomic status and actual claim age. And we find that naturally people who can continue to be linked to the labor force, who could extend their participation in the labor force beyond their full retirement age, and who have other financial sources different from the Social Security worker benefits, can actually delay their claiming until the latest age, which is age 70. And another element that we will find is that this feature of the Social Security actually is beneficial for both early claimers and late claimers, but the the way that the delayed retirement credit, or this credit that it's provided to workers who claim later, is operating, then it will create a different effect in terms of the progressivity of the Social Security formula. So though all of these things are playing an important role in the actual distribution of the Social Security benefits, and the actual effect on two things that two main aims that were allowed into the definition of the formula, which were progressivity and gender neutrality. So this is also relevant in terms of the mortality risk of each of or the mortality experience of each of the populations that I'm testing. So in this slides, I'm just showing how there's been variation, or we can actually observe variation between the claim age of men and women. And of the total population. Yet we also observe, and the literature also is points really sharply, that there's still a higher concentration of early claiming compared to delayed claiming. So the question would be, who is actually delaying this claim? Another important thing is that we've observed, and now getting into the gender part of the claim age strategy, we've observed that it's mostly women as cohorts advance into their claiming decision. It's mostly women who are taking advantage of the new proposed claiming ages, right? So men are still tending to, according to the cohort strategy, to stay within the early claiming age, which is between 62 and 65 years old, and then at their full retirement age, which is between 65 and 66 currently. And women are the one who, at later cohorts, as you can see, between the 1939 and 1944 cohorts, they are the ones who are actually increasing the percentage per cohort who are claiming at later ages, especially between 67 and 70. So what I'm inferring is that there's a strategic decision in terms of claiming on worker benefits coming from maybe couples, right? But mainly in relation to private information on health conditions and some idea of what the life expectancy can be. And that's the evidence of this adverse selection possibility. So an important thing is that if this has actually happened, if there is a claim dispersion, or if there's an actual dispersion in the claim ages and a correlation with mortality risk, with lower mortality risk when claiming later, then there is some action of private information in this claiming decision. So what we can say is benefits are not necessarily actuarially fair to everyone. And then persons with higher mortality actually benefit from claiming earlier, and people who claim with lower mortality actually benefit from delayed claiming, right? But the main point would be is who is actually having access to the credit, okay? So an important thing that I want to point out is that I'm not actually contesting the fact that there's a dispersion in the claim age. It's actually who's benefiting from the delayed retirement credit, which at this point is an 8% annual credit on the primary insurance amount of the worker. So it's a very high credit. It's a very high benefit that if I manage, or as I show here, once we link this to the socioeconomic status of those who actually delay claiming, it's the higher portion of the income levels that are actually benefiting from delayed retirement credits, and they also experience lower mortality. So they're going to perceive the benefits of this delayed retirement credit for a longer period of time compared to workers who actually claim at age 62 and are and perceive discounted benefits. So the effect of this private information on the claiming decision comes from that personal experience throughout their lifetime of work, right? So we also know that occupations that are more taxing on health are going to lead to, of course, a higher mortality risk, and also these occupations that are more taxing on health are going to require these workers to actually claim early because they have to retire from the workforce. So lower socioeconomic status workers are definitely not benefiting from the delayed retirement credit. That's also an important conclusion of my research. So what I actually do is I'm capturing the information only from people who are claiming their own workers' retirement benefits. And what I find is that compared to people who claim at age 62, for instance, men who claim between 63 and 64 years old have 26.4 lower mortality risk. And men who claim at age 65 have 41.8% of a lower mortality risk. Now, the most important one would be men and women, of course, who claim later than their full retirement age, which are the ones who are actually benefiting from a delayed retirement credit, and they actually experience a 52.4 lower mortality risk than those who claim at age 62. So how does that translate into a life expectancy compared to population average mortality of nearly 30 more years compared to those who claim at 62? And I'll show you the tables and the results of this. So why is this also relevant, and why are we talking about adverse selection? Well, when we think of the possibility of delaying claim, we could think as people buying actual additional annuities on Social Security. So they're actually kind of returning their benefits check to the Social Security and saying, I'm going to postpone my claiming, and you should pay me this credit, which is calculated at a specific real interest rate, right? And which once I claim at age 70, I will be able to cash at a higher level. So it's actually kind of like purchasing additional annuities. And although Social Security cannot be underwritten, right? So it shouldn't take into account characteristics of the individuals actually purchasing the insurance. It should be considering at this point the effects of social economic status on longevity. And we should start to consider different levels of occupational impact on this longevity risk. So I am actually proposing an alternative to adverse selection tests, right? And what I'll do is show that, that then there's a risk in addition to this, related to the benefits, to the benefit rules of the Social Security, when we also include spousal and survivor benefits, and we can account for a possible strategic claiming decision between couples. And in addition to this, what I am pointing out as well is that usually households that have a single high earner or double earner possibility of claiming Social Security are also higher socioeconomic status compared to those who reach retirement age as single individuals. So, so I'm going to move forward a little bit and tell you about the methodology. So I'm using the health and retirement study data for cohorts between 1909 and 1953 who have claimed Social Security retired worker benefits. And I estimate a Gompert survival model for individuals to relate the claiming age to and estimate the survival of these individuals according to their claiming age. So this will be the shape of the Gompert's model, where I have as a baseline people who claim at age 62, and I'm using as correlates a set of categorical variables that measure the claim age, right? And the important thing is I'm measuring those who claim at age 62 compared to those who claim at full retirement age, and compared to those who claim beyond full retirement age. So what I find, and an important thing to point out here is I find that according to my hypotheses, the signs of my coefficients actually prove this alternative test for adverse selection, which is a positive correlation between lower mortality risk and the actual purchase of annuities through the Social Security. This means that compared to anyone who claims at age 62 for both men and women, anyone who delays claiming past age 62 then has a lower mortality risk. Okay. So how does this translate? As I mentioned before, it actually tells us that a person who delays claiming past full retirement age a man has a 52.4 lower mortality risk, and for women it's a 31% lower mortality risk. Now, if I want to get to this further point of linking to socioeconomic status, I actually find also that using educational level as a measure of socioeconomic status, I also find the positive correlation between lower mortality risk and higher socioeconomic status, so, higher education, I'm sorry. So in terms of life expectancy, this means that a person who claims at age 62, according to the estimates of my model, has at this point, a man 30.43 years of life expectancy past age 62, and anyone who claims that between age 66 and 70 has 36.85 years of life expectancy past age 62. So this means that once they claim, they're going to be able to continue receiving the annuity with a credit for this amount of time. And compared to population average mortality, so this is kind of like showing how underestimated it would be to not consider the impact of occupational hazards and life expectancy. I'm actually capturing the healthiest portion of workers who are claiming Social Security. So I'm not considering people who claim disability benefits, for instance, and this is why you're going to see a high difference between the estimates from our model and actual period life expectancy at 62 calculated by the Social Security Administration. So for the Social Security, it's 20.11 years for men and 22.94 years for women, but this is considering all other average population, which is including the unhealthier portion of Social Security claimants, which are usually disability benefit claimants. So just to put a number in terms of value of this, so the expected present value of a claim of $1 of a Social Security benefit for a man between age 62 and 64 grows almost $4. This is at around 20%, right? So the actual benefit of this higher socioeconomic status population who is delaying claim and who has a higher life expectancy is providing them with a redistribution of the Social Security benefits for retired workers. So I'm sorry, I'm a little bit ahead of time. So I'm gonna point to, so what is the effect of, what are some of the things that I can claim in terms of gender neutrality, for instance, and it's that women are trying to postpone their claiming with also some knowledge of their actual life expectancy. So women are continuing to contribute to the Social Security and continuing to be linked to the labor force, and are one of the as a cohort trend, they're actually delaying claiming, and also men are doing it, but then there's also a big interaction between the role of other types of benefits, not only retired worker benefits. And what I'm actually showing is that the delayed retirement credit is too generous for people who delayed claiming, that mortality groups gain from equal premium and social insurance, but there should be a consideration of socioeconomic status, occupation, and differential mortality rates when defining the actually late retirement credit for different populations or according to the experience of different workers. So that would be like the main conclusion. I'm sorry, it just took too long. So I'll leave it there and I'll expand during the Q&A period.
Great, thank you. There we go. All right, so Stefan.
Hi, thanks, Dania. Let me try to get my window set up here. Full screen. Hopefully this looks all right to folks, and hopefully folks can hear me. Okay, I'm getting some nods, that's good. So hi, good afternoon or good morning. It's a privilege to spend this time with you today. I'm excited to share with you some research that I started as a graduate student, and that only ended in the summer. So you can imagine the months after that, you know, the project is still in the early stages. So I'm really excited to receive feedback, both conceptually and, you know, empirically, any sort of ideas that folks have. I also just want to acknowledge the moment that we find ourselves in. We are meeting today in different locations and time zones in the middle of a global pandemic. As social scientists, teachers, family members, and community members, we have an ethical responsibility to others. Right now, the scientific community is proud of developing a vaccine in record time, but we in this virtual room know that the human cost of the pandemic and its lasting impact will be determined by social and economic forces, not just the biology of the virus, right? And it's not just important for us to document these inequalities. We should make contributions to the political struggle against human suffering and injustice to the degree that we are able to do so, right? So the ethos that I would advocate for is not one of the arrogant scholar claiming to change the field with groundbreaking research, right? But I'm trying to approach my work right now with humility, hope, rage, and love, and see what comes of that. So today what I'm going to do is present some work on the effect of ACA Medicaid expansion on household wealth. And the main, let's see how I can change. Okay, great. The main research questions are, what is the empirical relationship between Medicaid and individual or household wealth, right? Is this causal? And how should we theorize this relationship specifically within, say, stratification economics, right? This is important because many 64.5 million people receive their health insurance through Medicaid. It's one of the largest programs of social insurance, right? It's meant to increase health insurance and access to healthcare, but it has other effects as well, including these effects on household finances, right? And on the other side, 1 in 5 American households has 0 or negative net worth. And we know that net worth is extremely unequally distributed between racial groups. So some background on Medicaid expansion, and just to give you a preview of my talk, I want to talk first about the empirics and show you what I found, and then I'm going to take a step back and say, how do we conceptualize this? And I'm happy to discuss both of those things. So some background on Medicaid expansion is that it was passed in 2010. Medicaid expansion itself started in 2014 with other states coming in later, or some states have not come in yet, right? Those are the orange states. And this is not my graph. It's from the Kaiser Family Foundation, or it's not my map. Oh my goodness, and I forgot to set the timer. Anyway, so ACA Medicaid expansion was intended to raise the, lower the rate of uninsured by, the ACA was meant to lower the rate of uninsured by the Medicaid expansion, easing and making it easier to qualify for Medicaid by raising the income limits, right? Getting rid of an asset test. It also included a dependent mandate, and there was the start of health insurance marketplaces with subsidized insurance for families between 138% and 400% of the federal poverty line, right? So I'm only going to talk about this first point. Medicaid itself, right, even in this first point, is a multi-part means-tested public health insurance program. Medicaid is coordinated and regulated at the federal level, but states have wide latitude to experiment with providing insurance coverage beyond the minimums set federally, right? So Medicaid provides comprehensive health insurance coverage for low-income children and parents, and after the ACA expansion, adults without dependents. But it also does lots of other things that I won't get into today, including supplemental health insurance to approximately 20% of Medicare beneficiaries, serving people with disabilities, and funding long-term care. Right? The uninsured rate fell immediately in the 2 years after ACA Medicaid expansion. It fell from, in general in the population, 17.8% to just 10% uninsured, right? But this drop was unequal itself. Latinxes and Blacks are overrepresented in states that did not expand Medicaid. So those are the states in orange here. When you think about Latinxes, you could think about Florida and Texas. When you think about African Americans, you can add Georgia to that list of states that are heavily contributing to the fact that people of color differentially were impacted by states choosing to expand Medicaid or not. So this is the uninsured rates by race, and you can see that the ACA Medicaid expansion helped reduce the uninsured rate for whites from 12.3% right in 2013 to just 7.5%. The rates lowered for all groups, but the uninsured rates are still much, much higher for Blacks and for Hispanics, and for the top category there with 21% uninsured is American Indian and Alaska Native. So here you could see over time, ACA Medicaid expansion and other aspects of the ACA lowering uninsured, we can dig into why folks are uninsured, or why we can start to answer those reasons with just basic summary statistics, right? And one is considering eligibility. So when you look at Hispanics, which is the third column there, right? More than any other group, ineligible for coverage due to immigration status, right? 32% of Latinxes ineligible due to immigration status. When you look at Blacks, the second column there, the difference between whites comes a lot in the coverage gap, right? Those states that did not expand Medicaid. So the coverage gap occurs because the ACA anticipated that Medicaid would be expanded up to 138% of the federal poverty line. So the marketplace subsidies only start at 138%. They don't go, they don't start below that, but states that did not, right, have people that both don't qualify for Medicaid and do not qualify for subsidized marketplace health insurance. Right? And you could see also the white group, more than any other group, benefits from employer-sponsored health insurance. So let's get into what I did, again, analyzing this relationship between Medicaid health insurance, public health insurance, and private savings or household savings. So the data that I'm using is the Survey of Income and Program Participation, or the SIPP. The SIPP has detailed monthly income and program participation information from January 2013 to December 2016. That's the wave of the SIPP, the 4 waves of the SIPP that I'm using, those 4 years, because they capture the before and after of the ACA Medicaid expansion. So I have a panel, but I only have wealth data corresponding to, theoretically, December 31st of each of those years. So I don't have monthly wealth data. I have monthly, did they use Medicaid or not? I don't have monthly wealth data, so I'm only going to be able to do my analysis on an annual basis. The graph that I produced here is just, I divided up the population of individuals with incomes below 400% of the federal poverty line to try to get a population most affected by Medicaid. I divided them up into 20 equal sized groups, right? And I just did their relationship between their monthly income and their asset difference. And here I'm looking at the difference between those who do not use Medicaid and those who are on Medicaid health insurance, right? And perhaps unsurprisingly, folks without Medicaid have higher assets than folks with Medicaid, right? And we'll talk a little bit about why this could be later on. One commonly cited explanation is the asset test. Medicaid, you need less than $2,000 of certain assets in order to qualify for Medicaid, but that was largely phased out in 2014, and the pattern still holds today. So it's not that people are reducing their savings in order to qualify. I would contend that that's not driving this story. So I'm trying to investigate this relationship right here. Is there a causal relationship between assets and this Medicaid use or eligibility, right? For me, Medicaid eligibility is what matters because Medicaid benefits can be retroactive. If you are uninsured, you go to the hospital, you have lots of expenses, they will sign you up for Medicaid, and that is a very common occurrence, right? So it's Medicaid eligibility that matters, not actually Medicaid program, not matriculation, not whether you've actually signed up for Medicaid, right? Currently. So the empirical framework that I'm using is a regression analysis, and I'm going to try to use an instrumental variable in order to get at the exogenous relationship between being eligible for Medicaid and wealth. As you can imagine, there's lots of things that I can't observe that connect those two variables, right? But I can instrument for individual Medicaid eligibility using the rollout, right? The uneven rollout of Medicaid after the ACA. So what I'm going to do is for each state and each demographic group, when I say demographic group in this context, I mean adults with dependents and adults without dependents. For each state and each year, I calculate the proportion of a set group of people. I take a random group of 500 people and I use that same 500 people in each state and each year. That gives me a number. For Florida, it's going to be a low number, low Medicaid generosity. For Vermont, it's going to be a high number, high Medicaid generosity. I'm going to use that to instrument for individual Medicaid eligibility. It varies by state and year, but it does not vary by individual characteristics, right? So that's hopefully going to give me a way to identify this relationship. Here, it's a little fuzzy, my apologies, but I think the next couple of slides are going to be better. But here are some of my results. So in regressions 1 through 5, I haven't started doing my IV, so I'm not instrumenting yet. I'm just using plain Medicaid eligibility, and I get a negative coefficient, and I'll interpret the negative 2.65 from the 5th regression there. That indicates a 93% decrease or 93% lower assets for those who are Medicaid eligible versus not, right? And I should back up a little bit. My sample is all adults ages 26 to 62. I have an age cutoff, but I don't have an income cutoff in my regressions. Why? Because I can't select on income when income is a primary determinant of eligibility. And that's changing, right? I also run some fixed effects regressions. The negative 0.32, I'll interpret that as a 27% lower assets for those who are Medicaid eligible versus not, right? But here's where it starts getting interesting, or you know, I hoped it would start getting more interesting, right? I can use the IV, right? Here I'm instrumenting. I'm using a couple things on the left-hand side. I'm showing you 2 things on the left-hand side. Number 1, I'm showing you liquid financial assets, which is checking account, savings account, CDs, things like that, right? I'm including, importantly, equity or illiquid assets. And I think that that would be a category that would be more affected by whether you have health insurance or not, right? Whether you have health insurance or not, you may change your savings behavior in the bank, but you're not likely going to, you know, sell your house or not, potentially, you know, barring bankruptcy. So I get a significant coefficient, or I get a significant effect, again, a negative effect for liquid financial, meaning that those Medicaid users are still having lower assets than others, and it's harder for me to detect effect using all of the controls with the total assets. Okay. I want to show you a couple more results, and then we'll go back and we'll zoom out and we'll think about how to theorize this relationship, right? So here I look at not just the asset side, but also the liability side, excuse me. So I look at liquid financial assets and total assets, but I also look at unsecured debt, which is a similar category to liquid financial assets. Unsecured debt is like credit card, right? And your total debt. So total debt includes mortgage, right? And here, again, I'm both instrumenting for Medicaid eligibility, and I'm including individual fixed effects. This is really getting narrow. So my identification is just coming from those individuals who were in a state that experienced both non-Medicaid expansion and then were Medicaid eligible, right? Or those individuals in states that experienced that change, right? Whether they moved to a different state or they were in the same state and the state eligibility rules changed. Right? So when I include year fixed effects, a lot of these effects start going away. And I'll tell you why, in this case, a non-significant coefficient is not a bad thing for me, right? And the last empirical results I'll show, and the last strategy that I have is I do this regression and I interact my instrument with demographic variables, right? I interact my instrument with race, and in this case, I have three categories, just black, white, other, right? I interact it with sex and interact it with education and other categories to see if there's a differential effect of Medicaid eligibility on household wealth, if that effect is different by race and gender, right? Not only can I interact that, I can also calculate the average effect over all of those individuals. So it's not just the average effect for being black or the average effect for being a woman. It's also, it's not just the marginal effect, it's also the average effect taking into all of the characteristics of women in my sample or all of the characteristic of whites in my sample, et cetera, right? And I'm only gonna show you one of those. I'm only gonna show you the beta term, basically, because I get very little results. And none of the average eligibility results are significant, right? But for some of these that I expected, I have no significant results for race assets. I have a significant result for unsecured debt, showing that unsecured debt is higher for those who are Medicaid eligible than for not, and that's only affecting blacks, different from whites, right? The significance level is that it's different from the reference group. And like I said, when I calculate the average effect of wealth, average effect on wealth of Medicaid eligibility for blacks using their characteristics, right? I get nothing significant. Same for gender. It's this methodology. That's the constraints that I'm bumping up against. Given that we have laid all that out, I'm going to take a step back and tell you how the literature typically theorizes this relationship, right? The primary way of thinking about public insurance and private savings is the precautionary savings model. Individuals save to smooth consumption and in case of unexpected shocks, right? Unexpected expenses. So if I do not have health insurance, I set money aside for health expenses. If the government says, aha, one day you are now eligible for health insurance, I will save less because now I have public health insurance and I can ease private insurance. That model predicts then that Medicaid users would have less assets, right? They would save less. And I find that, but I have I have suspicions that that is not as causal as we might think, right? So I don't think that households that are given public health insurance, that are given Medicaid, suddenly start saving less. I don't think that that's true. I suspect that Medicaid may enable households to save more. It may increase, it may affect their decisions in other ways, right? The other, as I said, the ASSA test was phased out, so that's no longer an explanation for this relationship. And other papers have looked at Gallagher, a relatively new paper, shows that the relationship, this precautionary savings model is accurate for households who are not financially constrained, but for those households that are financially constrained, right, they find zero effect. In other words, this could be, what I'm detecting could be a correlation, not a causal story, right? An alternative story that I am putting forth is that Medicaid has the potential to increase the utility of savings through higher life expectancy, increase the ability to save. It may raise incomes and transfers, right? Conditional on effective take-up and targeting, it could have all of these positive effects, right? So I'm trying to see, is there a way to detect any of these in the data? And so far, haven't come to, haven't gotten the data to tell this story, but I'm wondering if it's possible. I'm wondering if this is happening and the best way to do that, right? Stratification economics would look at this, and I'm glad that Dr. Myers put out laid out the foundation, right? Set up our thinking of stratification economics as trying to understand the fundamental causes of inequality. He was digging into administrative rules, right, with disadvantaged business enterprises. I'm trying to do something with a race-neutral policy and trying to see how we can understand it within a stratification economics context. So within that context, employer-sponsored health insurance is a job amenity that could be hoarded by certain groups to reinforce, hoarded by whites to reinforce intergroup inequality, right? There's research on the health-wealth nexus, a lot more pointing to the effects of wealth on health, right? Rather than this paper, I've been so far trying to tease out whether Medicaid affects wealth. And asset tests, which I'm glad that Medicaid largely no longer uses an asset test, right? But of course, we know that they're much more likely to cause harm than improve efficiency. Part of how I came to this literature, right, and I'm gonna try to wrap up soon, part of how I came to this literature is reading some ethnographies and some qualitative research on people who gained Medicaid through the ACA expansion. So this is a quote, right? I did have dental, but then when they stopped coverage and you couldn't find many dental places, my health deteriorated, right? I feel like becoming a doctor. I hate to say these words, but I'm going to say it. I have dental tools. I was doing my own dentistry, right? I shouldn't be doing that. So when you talk to people about the impact of Medicaid on their daily living or their household finances, they don't say, now I can reduce my savings, right? They say my quality of life increased in all of these other ways. And I'm trying to dig into to what that could mean for household wealth, right? So this is a diagram. I'm going to try to wrap up. It basically just says, it illustrates some of these channels, right? What I'll say, and this is what I would like to leave you with if you care to spend a couple minutes thinking about this project, right? My questions that I have still are, what are the tools we should use to understand the finances of low-wage households, right? If I had a nickel every time I said, look, I'm interested in this project of the savings of Medicaid households, people say, well, it's going to be zero. It's going to be almost zero. Or if it's going to be, $500, that's basically zero. So, I'm unsatisfied with the answer. Also, how should we theorize wealth as an outcome of interest in stratification economics when we know that it's overdetermined by factors like race and intergenerational transfers? Is there any point in looking at the effect of Medicaid, which at most, even in my looking for this effect, it's going to have a small effect? Is there any point in doing this research? How can I frame this to be in line with, this other stream of research, right? And lastly, which is the initial question I had when I started this, but it's going to come later. What's the relationship between employer-sponsored health insurance and individual wealth? If you get health insurance from your employer, right, does that also have the potential to increase your wealth? And if so, right, where I'm going with this obviously is the distribution of good quality jobs is not equal also among racial groups. So what does that imply for wealth inequality? With that, I will I'll leave it there. Thanks, folks.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Lefebvre. Dr. Wilson. Hold on, you're muted.
Great, now I have a rehearsal. Okay, so the project that I'm presenting today is very much so something that is in process. It's something that I'm working on. And it's a collaborative project with the Insight Center for Community Economic Development in Oakland, California, doing work with workers who've been impacted by the current crisis. And I'll give you a little bit more context to understand how this project has evolved since we started it. I want to thank Stefan and Marta and Dr. Myers and Dr. Francis for being on this panel. I think that you'll be able to see in this case study, a very specific case study of a specific place, New Orleans, how the themes in this panel sort of intersect. So what I'm looking at is what I'm calling an intersectional approach to occupational crowding and applying it to understanding the labor market in New Orleans or in Orleans Parish, Louisiana. I'm calling it intersectional because although occupational crowding studies are all intersectional when they take account the intersections between race and ethnicity and gender, I'm also going to add in a couple other categories that are of importance for this project and the time in which I'm doing this research. So the project is, like I said, collaboration with the Insight Center. It is in the same vein of research as other projects that they have released. They have another paper called Mississippi is America, which I believe Professor Hamilton also worked on, about how racism and sexism sustain this two-tiered labor market in Mississippi, and it constricts worker power and equality across the state as well as the US. It's a pattern that is found throughout the United States. So originally this project before the pandemic hit was meant to focus on the really specific issues within the service sector in New Orleans that come out of the redevelopment, the uneven redevelopment pattern post Katrina and post Great Recession. And the original intention was to look at hospitality, tourism, restaurants, these sorts of service sectors, as well as the care work sector, to understand how changes in the industrial organization of these industries is now contributing to perhaps heightened patterns of racial crowding in certain occupations, and in particular in low wage work. But the pandemic sort of readjusted the focus of this to also put into view how now those occupations are also additionally more impacted and more precarious due to the differential impacts of the pandemic in terms of unemployment risk, occupational exposure, and so on. So the point of doing this sort of work was originally to inform, workers, worker organizations in New Orleans in the type of work that they're doing for organizing and actions. But it's also meant to inform sort of what the local policy desires are of people who are working in New Orleans for a more inclusive and equitable recovery. So this analysis is very descriptive, and it is meant to inform some qualitative, as Stefan brought up, qualitative research with workers themselves in Orleans Parish, in New Orleans. So the Insight Center will be matching some of my findings about crowding with participant interviews from different worker groups across Orleans Parish to sort of match those two together to get sort of the fuller picture of what's sort of really going on in the sort of local labor market, and more importantly, what people need right now. So informing those sort of policies from people's actual experiences rather than say just a applied microequation. That's speaking to Dr. Myers' presentation here. So for this, what I did is very simple. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the occupational crowding literature, and then I'll show you some of my findings. But I'm going to preface it with saying that what I did was very, very simple, quite literally descriptive statistics of looking at the proportions of different demographic groups within occupations using the 2018 American Community Survey microdata for Orleans Parish. 2018, because 2019 wasn't out yet, so that is something we will be updating. But I do want to speak a little bit about more of the sort of literature on occupational crowding to situate this analysis. So that said, my findings are very preliminary, and they also likely are a little bit skewed because I am extrapolating from that microdata. So you can take that with sort of a grain of salt, but it is meant to sort of be the preliminary analysis to start matching these interviews and then go back in and see what we can do with this in terms of more research on the paper. So I'm looking forward to comments and suggestions on that. So we really need to understand the context of post-Katrina, post-Great Recession New Orleans, or Orleans Parish, which is the county seat of the city of New Orleans, because it's incredibly important for understanding why these patterns of crowding matter, how they came to be, and in particular, the impacts of a very uneven redevelopment policy after Katrina and after the Great Recession. And so the redevelopment plans that were set in place during the recovery really set the stage for exclusionary labor market and sort of amplified dynamics of occupational crowding. The history of the city of New Orleans can show you how all of this has been set in motion since the very beginning. And I've sort of put a footnote here to just let you all know of a book that I found very enlightening on this, which is Development, Drowned and Reborn from Clyde Woods, which was published posthumously in 2017. This is more American studies territory, but this book shows how different redevelopment regimes in New Orleans since the beginnings of settler colonialism have created the structures of racial and ethnic stratification, as well as stratification that intersects with gender and immigration and so on. And so what that means is that on that topography, we're sort of laying a new crisis that is further exacerbating some of these issues. So to put it more specific to what that post-Katrina recovery looks like and how that now impacts what workers are experiencing in this current pandemic recession, the post-Katrina recovery plan focused heavily on developing the industries of hospitality and tourism, and mainly aimed at more affluent, more white consumers. It reduced union density within the area, particularly within occupations like education and in the public sector. And it also changed the composition of the labor force due to evacuations, displacement, as well as a wave of immigration for the reconstruction efforts. And that immigration was mainly Latinx workers, many of which were undocumented. And so when we're talking about current workers in New Orleans, we need to understand this sort of topography that we're working on, where you have a deeply sort of segmented and segregated labor market, and a really deep reliance on low-wage workers for the sort of redeveloped hospitality and tourism sectors. So one note that I do want to make is that I'm going to be focusing, all of these estimates are on current workers, so people who in 2018 were employed. But I want to really note that the sort of aftermath of Katrina and the Great Recession meant that you had long-term structural unemployment, especially amongst Black workers. You also had a lot of displacement of workers into other areas. And I also want to make a footnote that while I'm focusing on current workers, New Orleans has additional issues, such as being perhaps one of the most carceral cities in the US, in a state with the highest incarceration rate in the country. And so these are compounding strains on especially low-wage workers that are being dealt with in this current context of the pandemic. So the map I have here is a map of low-wage workers in New Orleans and Orleans Parish. This is not my map. This is from some economic geography by someone named Keegan in, I believe, Urban Geography was the journal. And I just felt that her work really summed up the situation and the context for this. So I'm going to do that thing where I read you something someone else wrote to set the context of post-Katrina New Orleans and what that labor market looks like. So Keegan writes, and this article is called Black Workers Matter. It was published in 2020, before the pandemic. For low-wage, predominantly Black workers in New Orleans, post-Katrina redevelopment presents a new and revanched spatial configurations of inequality. In the most recent data, over 25% of New Orleans residents were estimated to live below the poverty line, and nearly 75% of whom are African American. Yet redevelopment projects have mainly targeted wealthy residents and tourists. The city has seen a rise in concentrations of low-wage neighborhoods known as wage deserts, where at least 80% of earners in census tract make less than $3,333 per month. Workers living in wage deserts primarily work in accommodation and food services, healthcare and social assistance, retail, waste management, transportation, and construction. 83% of people in New Orleans wage deserts identify as Black. And the median incomes for African Americans in New Orleans was $25,000 per year versus $60,000 for their non-Hispanic white counterparts. Average Black household incomes have dropped since Hurricane Katrina, while the income gap between white and Black households has grown. While African Americans comprise 60% of the city's population, white residents occupy 60% of the managerial and professional positions. For New Orleans Black workers, the changing landscape is characterized by rising rents and stagnant poverty levels and low wage employment in new restaurants, retail spaces, and construction sites. These growing industries offer low-paying, unstable jobs with high rates of racial and gender discrimination, as well as illness and injury. This is before the pandemic. This is in the years after the 2005 Katrina hurricane. So we're on some very unequal territory to begin with. So my job is to figure out what that looks like now and how this can inform the research that is going to be paired with participant interviews and hopefully coming up with sort of a worker-centered set of policy recommendations in Orleans Parish. So some background on why I'm going to talk about occupational crowding. As you can see from that quote, it's a very stratified city. More than half of the workers in New Orleans identify as Black or African American. There is a recent increase in those workers who are identifying as Latinx due to immigration. And so what you see is a very crowded labor market. So in this literature, I'll sort of refer back to the kind of original piece by Barbara Bergman in 1971, where she writes of occupational crowding as one of the explanations for understanding persisting wage inequality between different demographic groups. And she finds that in her research, Black men are overrepresented or therefore crowded into low-wage occupations. Gibson, Darity, and Professor Myers later extend this analysis to look at the exclusion from high status private sector managerial positions, right? This is the sort of flip side of crowding, is exclusion from other positions, which maintains inequality. And then King later on also uses the crowding index developed by Bergman tied to the baseline of white male employment, which is the highest wages and status, to show sort of a racialized and gendered shift amongst Black women workers into clerical occupations. Most recently, Professor Holder has extended this analysis to understanding the recovery since the Great Recession. And her work is very important here for my understanding of what's going on in New Orleans. While hers is a national study of workers specifically Black workers and Black male workers after the Great Recession, she shows that the changing composition of work and sort of the changing dynamics of the service sector, which also includes a lot of care occupations, has sort of created new patterns of both gendered and racialized forms of crowding. Okay, so one second, I just want to make sure I have my slides right. Oh, okay, yeah. So I had them out of order, my apologies. So what I'm going to do is extend this a little bit in the most simplest way for now, before I sort of go back into revising this and when it becomes paired with participant interviews. We wanted to extend the analysis not just to the intersections of race, ethnicity, and gender, but we wanted to extend it even further to encompass some other dimensions and axes that are of particular importance at the moment in sort of the context of American labor markets. So those are citizenship and age, which speaks to some of our previous presentations as well. So we're drawing on this concept of intersectionality, which I'm sure we all know from Kimberly Crenshaw, that you can't just look at one or the other, you have to really overlap these sort of dimensions to understand what the real effects are. And so empirically what that means is that I can't just look at, oh, just women workers or just workers of certain demographic groups. I really have to look at how they intersect together and at those specific groups that are impacted by all of these different dimensions. So we extend it to look also, in addition to race and gender, we also want to look at citizenship and age. Now, citizenship is a question included in the American Community Survey, but the response rate is relatively low. But we can sort of start to extrapolate what those sort of dynamics are with citizenship and employment and whether or not non-US citizens are being crowded into certain professions. We're also looking at age. And so this brings back to sort of Marta's presentation, because we know that the dynamics for this current event, the pandemic recession, are really going to be impacting different age groups quite differently. And so what we're interested in is young workers under the age of 25 and older workers over the age of 65, especially since we know that there have been dynamics of those with dependents more likely to drop out of the labor force. And on the other side of it, those older workers also more likely to drop out of the labor force, in part due to the effects of the pandemic economically, as well as in terms of public health. All right, so that's where we are. So to give a really quick picture of what I found, and I'm going to admit it's not the best picture, we're working on it. And if you have ideas of how to represent these data better, please let me know. This is just a quick little bubble graph of all current workers in 2018 in Orleans Parish. And this is for Black female employed workers. And the size of the bubble is roughly showing the number of workers within each occupation. And on the bottom, you have the percentage of Black female employed within that occupation. And so what you can see is that there are particular sectors such as healthcare support, office and support, food prep, sales, education, that are very much so crowded occupations just in this very simple analysis. And including some occupations where they're over 75%, like in healthcare and support. Similarly, for Latinx women, you see these sort of crowding patterns. And I want to footnote this with saying that Latinx workers in New Orleans are about 7% of the labor force. So when you see a percentage within an occupation that is, say, over that or over 10%, that indicates to me that there's a pretty high level of crowding going on. And so you see that in buildings and grounds cleaning and maintenance, personal care and service occupations, and especially in farming and fishing occupations. And so these are just for women workers, which I'm highlighting, but you can see similar patterns amongst different groups as well. And I'll try to break that out in a little bit more detail here. I will say my biggest challenge so far with working in this literature is representing numbers of occupations cleanly. So it's just mostly written out to show the results because it seemed a little overwhelming to have graphs with lots of words on them. So I want to go through some of the occupations that have been most impacted by the current crisis. So I'm going to start with food service and then buildings and maintenance. And so these two are identified as particularly impacted by layoffs and unemployment, but also by exposure risk on the job. And you can see the literature of occupational exposure risk in the US and how it is differentiated between different occupations. And so what you see is a very similar pattern than what you'd expect given the literature, especially the more recent literature from Michelle Holder's work, where you see Black or African-American women and young workers under the age of 25, as well as over the age of 65, crowded into food prep, servers, chefs, and cooks types of occupations. But what you see when you drill down a little bit further is that supervisors in those larger categories are more likely to be male and more likely to be not Black, so white. Food prep workers are more likely to be young workers. About 30% of food prep workers are under the age of 25. And I thought it was quite interesting to note that bartenders are overwhelmingly female workers, but much more likely to be white workers. Non-restaurant food servers are almost exclusively Black or African American, and this refers to non-restaurant food servers being food service, things like Sodexo and banquet, hotel industry, things that get categorized under not a restaurant, but food service. And these are overwhelmingly Black workers, and 30% of them identify as young workers. On the other side, looking at buildings and maintenance is where you see the role of things like citizenship playing a really important role in these sort of more precarious jobs. So housekeeping and janitorial supervisors tend to be older, whiter, but the folks who actually work in those occupations, janitors and building cleaners, are much more likely to be Black or African American, and 11%, remember 7% is in the labor force, 11% of these workers are identifying as Hispanic or Latinx. Within that, maids and housekeepers are overwhelmingly women, 87% women, 62% of these workers identifying as Black or African American, 27% as Latinx workers, and about 27% of these workers reported not holding US citizenship. So that was actually a lot considering the sort of limited observations that we have to work with. This all matches up as well to what we know about the sort of what's going on in terms of unemployment in New Orleans. If you look at the Warren mass layoff notices, you'll see that in New Orleans, layoffs are very much so concentrated so far in hospitality, tourism, restaurants, and food service of the ones that, and gaming, of the ones that have been reported using the mass layoff notices, which is only for really large employers. I want to focus really quickly as I wrap up here on the care sector, because this is really important. And as we know from Michelle Holder's work, this is a really important dimension that is driving some of these patterns. 91% of nursing, psychiatric, and home health aides are Black or African American, and almost exclusively female workers. These are obviously jobs that are deeply impacted by the current crisis in various ways, including exposure. Registered nurses are more likely to be women workers, and specifically respiratory therapists in particular are nearly all African American or Black workers. Childcare workers are much more likely to be women, and particularly women of color, and are more likely to be younger workers, with about 10% of childcare workers reporting to not have US citizenship in that data. Again, grain of salt with that. Personal care aid workers, again, this is very deeply impacted by the current situation, are much more likely to be young or older. It's sort of a bifurcated occupation in that way, and very much so likely to be Black or African American women workers. And as you can see, I just put some of the quick statistics about the current crisis in Orleans Parish as compared to other areas of Louisiana. And what you see is that the impact of the crisis in terms of things like unemployment is much higher within Orleans Parish. And given this analysis, this very simple analysis of crowding, what you can see is what that means is disproportionately impacting workers who are already most marginalized. So what that means in terms of organizing and policy advocacy and so on, it means centering especially Black women workers, Latinx women workers in the recovery efforts, especially given that the previous redevelopment regimes explicitly did not do that. They were very not democratic and very much so favored the interests of sort of wealthy white consumers and tourists. And going back to Dr. Meyer's presentation, what we need in this sort of policy is that sort of centering of actual race consciousness in the policies, because otherwise you end up exacerbating this stratification that already exists. So I have further research questions, which we can talk about. I have questions about wanting to understand the sort of local patterns of market power, some of the laws and policies after Katrina that have contributed to these patterns. I'm also interested in thinking about what those specific sort of worker-informed policies would be for recovery. And in the broader scope, I'm thinking more about this sort of area of work, occupational crowding, and how we can expand it to include other issues like age and citizenship where appropriate in our sort of research questions. And going back to the original question that we were supposed to answer before the pandemic was understanding how different issues in industrial organization like workplace fishing, subcontracting, franchising has impacted racialized and gendered patterns of crowding and low wage work. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you to all of our panelists for your presentations. And now I think we will open it up to questions. I'll give preference right now to questions posed from the audience. We have one so far. If you have questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A functionality here in Zoom. And I'll start by posing the question that was asked, the first question that's asked. It is to Dr. Wilson. This is important work, thank you. How did you get interested in New Orleans? Has any of your research been affected by the pandemic and lower ability to travel to New Orleans?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer that. So I originally had read about New Orleans and tried to understand sort of the history of it actually when I was doing my dissertation research, which was on inequality in schooling, and the example of what happened in New Orleans public schools was something that I had looked at. But this project was something that was actually developed by Ann Price and the awesome folks at Insight, the Insight Center, who are trying to do this sort of mapping for a lot of major areas in the country to understand these patterns and inform local policy, which I think is just the coolest approach ever to do more activist-oriented type of research. And so I sort of tapped on to the amazing work that they were already doing in Mississippi and now in New Orleans, and they plan to do in many other areas.
And then I'll also just, I believe you can use your hand raising functionality, and then we should be able to unmute you. I think I'm able to, yes, push allow to talk. So if someone wants to vocalize the question, that should be fine as well. You should be able to do that. And then I'll also say that I have questions as well, so I'm not afraid to ask them. I wanted to see if the panelists, if you guys have questions you'd like to pose to each other.
I want to just raise a summary comment. All of these papers deal with different aspects of disparities and inequality. whether or not they're in Medicare, whether it's retirement, whether or not it has to do with the risk associated with losing your job in New Orleans. All of these papers have to do with an aspect of inequality. What's different is understanding this inequality from a structural perspective. What's different is that we're looking at the inequality not as some sort of exogenous factor, but rather we're asking the why part of the inequality. And so I'm intrigued by Anastasia's comments about intersectionality, because the why part, why is it that Black and Latinx women are concentrated in one particular segment of occupations in New Orleans that's going to be hit the hardest? The why part is an important methodological shift within the economics profession, because in the past we didn't ask that question. In the past, what we kind of did was we controlled all the different things, and the question is, what is the effect of COVID-19 on unemployment? And it's somewhat parochial, it was deemed, to ask, well, what's the effect on Black women? What I think Anastasia is saying is, no, this is not parochial. It is the core of the analysis. And that's where stratification economics comes in. And for those of you in the audience who've never heard of stratification economics, then I think that what you're learning here is that there are some real weaknesses in the approaches we've taken in the past of looking at inequality. And one route to try to correct those weaknesses is to have a more intentional approach that stratification economics offers.
That's excellent. Thank you for that, Dr. Myers. So I have a question for you, Dr. Myers, and it's looking at the lens of affirmative action in college admissions, right? I mean, and you spoke to us about affirmative action in minority business contracting and so on. But thinking about college admissions, it got me to think about there's a Fryer-Lowry paper that poses a model that's very much in the tradition of traditional microeconomic theory, where they pose that a college is trying to maximize the post-admissions performance, and what gets us to how well somebody's going to do is their SAT scores, which we know also now is not necessarily as highly correlated as they pose in their theory. So I guess my question is, how should we be looking at that through the lens of stratification economics, one, and then two, I guess a part of that is thinking, right, in the absence of race-based affirmative action, just how you mentioned the absence of goals, the absence of race-based affirmative action, right?
I think affirmative action and admissions is actually an excellent way of thinking about a natural experiment during the COVID-19 pandemic, because many graduate schools, for example, have dropped the use of the GRE scores in their admissions, or they have decided not to admit anybody at all rather than drop their GRE. And it turns out that some of the graduate admissions departments are acknowledging, or at least they are alleging, that the GRE is discriminatory, and they contend that if only we eliminate this discriminatory signal, then we'll solve our problem of underrepresentation of certain groups. And I think it's very interesting because I don't actually think using stratification economics is true that eliminating this bias signal is going to eliminate underrepresentation. Because suppose all these signals are biased, and you eliminate one bias signal, like the example, now we put greater weight on grade point averages. Do you believe that grades are not biased? So what stratification economics is going to force you to do is going to force you in this kind of natural experiment to ask not just whether or not there's a change in the representation, but whether or not there's a change in the structure of the curriculum, whether or not the curriculum is being decolonized. In other words, the people who say that what our goal is in dropping the GRE is to increase the representation of the represented group, they're the same people who are engaging in the teaching over decades of programs that Sandra Doherty talked about in the previous panel about the fact that, there's virtually no African Americans getting their PhDs from some top, economics departments. So, Danny, my response is that this is an absolutely fantastic time to be exploring some of these stratification versus conventional, policy analysis methods, and just ask the question, do they predict well? I mean, I'm trying to take the point of view of testing two different models. You have a model that's the conventional economic model, and then you have a model that's the stratification economics model. The stratification economics model doesn't predict that dropping the GRE is going to change the racial composition of your department. And the reason why is that the GRE alone isn't the source of the disparity or the inequality. What the GRE is doing, it is just kind of validating what the existing structural impediments happen to be. And so I think that a lot of good research can come about, that not only develops the structural, the stratification economics approaches, but permits us to test the stratification economic predictions against alternative predictions.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Let's see. I should announce, I wrote it in the chat, but the hand raising option is now available. It should be available at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question and you want to verbalize it instead of typing it in the Q&A, please use the hand raising and we'll unmute you. In the meantime, look, go ahead, Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, I had a question for Stefan. Thinking about this question you had about the assumptions of sort of a neoclassical model are that people are going to set aside money to save if they don't have access to healthcare. And if they are not like enrolled in ACA, I guess is also part of the assumption there. And I have to have just like a very, I don't know if you'll be able to answer if you've done it, if whether or not you looked at whether or not that's actually true, like in your data, or looked at different groups, like based on like, oh, these people actually did save versus not based on their enrollment in ACA from the data you have. I'm not sure if that's clear, but maybe you can speak to some answer.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, part of what you're saying is it the case? Yeah, it's not the case that people who are using Medicaid save, or it is the case that they have lower savings, but it's not clear to me that that validates the precautionary savings model, right? Yeah, I don't know.
Question about New Orleans. I think one of the things that was interesting, out of many things that were interesting, was the result you posted where a lot of the supervisors, right, they are more likely to be white male, even in an occupation that may be a low wage occupation or a precarious occupation with regards to both COVID and post Katrina economy. And I guess I wonder if you speak to that a little bit, because I think that some of those power dynamics are really important, especially when we think about COVID-19 and how it's not just income and not just whether or not I can keep my job, but even if I do keep my job, how much control do I have in my work environment over what happens to me?
Yeah, I think that's a great question for further research, not just in this specific area, but for any research that's looking at the dynamics between crowding and what's going on with COVID exposure and control over your work. This has been a huge debate since it started, was, workers who were advocating for getting, hazard pay that didn't disappear after a month, and, other sorts of policies. And I think this is really interesting what you're bringing up, which is that there's a definite power dynamic, besides the obvious one, between supervisors and workers. And so then how do we layer in the fact that this is a racialized and a gendered power dynamic, especially when we think about some of the industries that are being affected in New Orleans, the gaming, hospitality, tourism, which are already, like, to use not super scientific terms, they're just bad jobs. Like they can suck for all the reasons you can imagine. And so thinking about that overlapping power dynamic, yeah, I would be interested in doing more research on that, or learning more and seeing what other people have written about those power dynamics at work.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from an attendee, Daphne Green. You are now unmuted.
Daphne Greenwood.
Sorry, Greenwood, thank you. Sorry.
So I guess it's a two-part comment and a question. I mean, it seems obvious to me that if you were going to study the effects of Medicaid expansion on savings, you'd have to consider all the other things that affect savings, not just Medicaid expansion. And that if people have been doing it that way, that's just a classic flaw of neoclassical economics. To not look at all the factors, but just to pick one that fits sort of the existing frame of how people think about things, or maybe fits with a favorite model like the precautionary savings model. And I would really encourage, to study the effects of how employer provided health insurance affects savings, as if you wanted to counteract that. So I guess my question is, I'm interested in stratification economics. I'm an institutionalist economist. And I think there's a lot of overlap between the two, and sort of curious as to whether stratification economics is, getting ready to abandon some of its attachment to the neoclassical tools that a lot of the people have been educated with, and expanding into looking at what institutionalists and feminists.
A question for me. So, Manny, let's be clear that Sandy Dodd is one of the leading architects of structural economics, and he's trained as a neoclassical economist. But Sandy's first job was at the University of Texas, which was one of the last outposts of institutional economics in America. And it turns out that, Sandy and I were both at Texas, and we kind of grappled with the tensions between the standard neoclassical assumptions and the institutional assumptions, as well as other heterodox assumptions. And I don't think that the intention was originally to create a brand new field, but rather to try to understand as well as we can, what the causes and implications of deeply embedded inequalities happen to be. And from my point of view, also trying to understand what the remedies are, what the policy interventions happen to be. And so in answer to your question, I think that stratification economics actually has at one of its feet, and deeply in institutional, economics, and the institutionalist approach. And for those of you who want a copy of my course outline on stratification economics, we actually began with readings from the institutional economics. Veblen, for example, is one of the intellectual predecessors, to what we're looking at. But this is not really an attack on neoclassical economics. What it's doing is attempting to piece together something that does provide predictive validity. And do I believe that, for example, in the case of retirement decisions, people delay receiving their Social Security benefits so that they can have a high return later on? Yeah, I think some people do that. It may be different across different groups. It may be different depending on whether or not you're in a household that has multiple individuals who are facing various crises in their lives, as opposed to individuals just looking forward to moving down to Florida and retiring. And so those are some of the things that institutional economists have looked at, but the things that a neoclassical approach might ignore because they're not asking the question. And so I think that when we embrace this idea of stratification economics, what we're embracing is moving out of the confines of the simple rational choice model that some of us have learned. Now, I should also point out that behavioral economics has much to say as well. The irony of it is that most of the stratification economists agreed with some of the hypotheses of people like Herbert Simon about the fact that people are not maximizing, but they might be satisficing and other sort of approaches. So in some respects, it's not a complete rejection of neoclassical economics. And let me also say that much of the econometric methodologies have to rely on something, have to rely on some set of assumptions about what's driving people's choices and behaviors. And it turns out that it's easier to adopt neoclassical assumptions when you're trying to find identification restrictions in your econometrics models than it is to adopt institutionalist or stratification economic assumptions. And that's just simply because we haven't invested a lot of time and effort of figuring out how do I operationalize the institutional factors, or how do I operationalize the stratification factors. So I would say there's a lot of work ahead, but I'm glad. I actually appreciate the fact that somebody had a panel at the Allied Social Science Association meeting, not one panel, but several panels where we're talking about this topic. Now, Professor Francis was at that last meeting. Where were we? San Diego? Was it San Diego? Where we were off in some remote. Where were we? We were in some remote room that nobody could find. That the internet didn't work in. But anyway, we had a panel on stratification economics. And how many people showed up?
Maybe two.
Now at least we had 27 who showed up to today's panel. So I guess we're doing a better job.
It's progress.
Dr. Woodbend, did you want to say anything about Medicare?
Just to say that I, associate myself with the comments of Dr. Myers. I think one of the most important things that he highlighted about stratification economics at the beginning of the talk is considering identity as exogenous, right? And we collect certain pieces of information. So it's not just that we haven't invested the time, but the tools at our disposal in terms of data availability lend themselves to locating the faults in the individual rather than digging deep into how are these identities formed And what and to Dr. Greenwood's point, what institutions are they interacting with, and what are the qualities of those institutions? If we had access to that information, it would be a lot more straightforward, I think.
I think it's interesting to point out, right? The tools that are available to us through data availability at that point. And I think that one thing that's important to do is to continue to try and impact the type and amount of data that's collected on things like wealth, right? Like the National Asset Scorecard. That was good. Like projects like that to help us get more of the data needed to ask some of these underlying questions, right? That stratification economics is concerned with. Okay, we have about 5 or 6 more minutes. Any other questions, thoughts?
I have a question or like thought about Martha's good thing, which I thought was really interesting, especially seeing those tables, those actuarial tables about how those who are claiming later they're getting more, right? And obviously, if you're claiming earlier, it's probably because you're experiencing some adverse reasons to not continue working. I was wondering, you broke those out by gender, which was also really illuminating. I'm wondering if you're thinking about breaking them out by race or different SES groups that you can sort of identify. Yeah.
Yes, there's plenty. Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I had so many connection issues. Yes, definitely. Like previous literature has broken down claiming ages according to different socioeconomic status characteristics, gender, racial characteristics, education. I do not incorporate it yet here because I didn't have enough information to actually estimate the survival curves and the mortality rates. But we
I think we're having a connection issue. Okay. We'll see if she's able to come back. But I would like to take this opportunity to again recommend to you other sessions on stratification economics, the theme hosted by the Association for Social Economics, and also to take this opportunity to plug the review of social economy as a great outlet for your research and for you to find research, which is the journal of the association. So I guess with that, we can say final thank you to our panelists, and again, thank you to all you who attended, and we will hopefully see you at other sessions.
Thanks, Tania. Good to see you all.